Hi everyone, welcome back to the Physical Educator. Today we're going to talk about the third aspect of skill in sport, principles of skill learning. We're going to start as we usually do with the objectives to see exactly what it is you're being asked to do within this unit. So, principles of skill learning. Within this unit there's a range of information and each piece of information has multiple factors to it. So every time there's something new, there's a number of explanations behind that or a number of examples behind that. So something to bear in mind with this, doesn't look too difficult from the offset, but there is substance behind each of these objective points. 5.3.1 is asking us to distinguish between learning and performance. So the main differences between learning and performance. Learning is a relatively permanent change in performance brought about by experience. Now, when you learn something, it tends to stay in your memory, but it can take time for it to transfer and shuttle in between short-term memory and long-term memory. But ultimately, it is a permanent change, even if it's a minor one, that takes place, and it happens because of your experience and your exposure to the stimulus of learning. Whereas performance is a temporary occurrence fluctuating over time. If this changes over time, it often infers that learning has taken place. And with performance, you can have form. So it is temporary because you can have high moments and low moments even though the learning has still taken place. So it's temporary and it changes. Next, we're going to describe the phases of learning. 3 phases of learning. First one is cognitive. This is the early stage of learning, or the first stage. When attempting the skill, the performer must concentrate thoroughly on the basic fundamentals, such as positioning of the body, timing of subroutines, etc. The performer will require explanations and demonstrations by a coach or via the internet or YouTube in order to provide feedback so they can attempt the skill for the first time, or like I said, in them very early stages. And that is known as the cognitive phase of learning. When we practice and we start to play the activity for a little bit more, we then move into the intermediate stage of learning, which is the associative stage. The performer understands how to perform the skill and must focus on practice to eliminate mistakes and to strengthen that memory trace, that shuttle between short and long-term memory. Throughout the practice, the performer will focus on improving accuracy, consistency, fluency, precision and timing. And with a performer in this stage, the performer will draw upon previous performances alongside more detailed feedback by the coach. They will also require intrinsic motivation from themselves, extrinsic motivation from others in order to develop learning. And this is the middle stage of learning. This is the associative stage. Then we have the final stage of learning, autonomous. This is where you are a bit more advanced, potentially elite as a performer. The performer has a completely embedded motor program within their memory and can perform the skill with little or no thought of technique or mastery of the skill. Instead of this, they spend this time focusing on how to use the skill to better their overall performance. They can also think about the skill complexity and the variation of skill. So instead of just thinking, this is my best skill, I'll perform it, they can consider through tactics which is the best skill to use in that scenario for the outcome as opposed to what they feel most comfortable with. They will also try to develop the speed, the accuracy and the complete precision of the skill and develop that on a consistent basis. However, this isn't permanent and the performer must continually practice to maintain this stage of learning. So if you're an elite performer, 5 or 10 years after being an elite performer without the practice, you'll be somewhere in between the associative and the autonomous stage, and you'll probably have to think about your technique a little bit more than you did when you were in your pomp when you were playing. Next, we need to outline the different types of learning curve. So we've got 4 different types of learning curve. We'll start with a linear curve, the ideal curve. And as you can see on the graph, and this will be the same for each of these learning curves, we've got performance up the y-axis, practice across the x-axis, and we're going to look at the relationship between the two. So within a linear curve, practice is continually successful. And as you can see, it's just going up and up and up. The more you practice, the better your performance gets. And this is a perfect scenario. The truth is, and the reality of it is, you won't experience this forever. Even if you had this momentarily, the truth is one of the other learning curves would come into play. You can't keep getting better and better and better and better and better. There has to be a shelf life, unfortunately. There has to be a ceiling on that. However, during this linear curve, motivation and focus are very high. You can't continually get better without motivation. However, you can also argue that because you're getting better, that also increases the motivation. So there's a little bit of a motivation cycle here that needs to be high for this to happen. Positive coach interaction is also vital because you keep getting better and better and better. So the second something is slightly off, or even before something is slightly off, the coach intervenes with fantastic feedback and advice, and the performer keeps improving their skill level. And this is the linear curve. Next, we've got the positive accelerated curve. And as you can see, similar to when we looked at biomechanics on our velocity time graphs and our distance time graphs, we've got that accelerated curve again, which we had there. What it represents here is that in the early stages of practice, something wasn't quite right. Something wasn't quite right, and that's why the performance didn't increase. However, about 3/4 of the way through practice, boom, something's happened. We've hit the jackpot, and performance has rapidly increased. So what is it that's happened? Either the task complexity was too high at the start, so therefore it was too hard for you to grasp, or it was too easy at the start, so therefore what you were practicing wasn't impacting your performance too much. Other reasons could be that motivation has grown as the practice has grown, so therefore you're working harder, you're more focused on improving, and therefore the practice is more purposeful, therefore improvement to performance. Or the coach interaction and the relationship improved over time. Maybe the coach was using the wrong teaching style or the wrong techniques for you as a performer, and therefore it took a while before you realise what worked within that relationship between the two. And these are the factors that can infer a positive accelerated curve as a learning curve. We have the opposite. We also have a negative accelerated curve. And this means you've made rapid levels of progress at first, which is fantastic. But what's happened to cause this drop-off in performance? It could be that motivation has decreased over time. It could be that you've made massive amounts of progress at first, but then the coach relationship has broken down, or there's a lack of input to take you to that next stage. And these are the reasons that could contribute towards a negative accelerated curve. And within these curves, we've also got a plateau. And the plateau is the bit that levels off. And this can happen for a number of reasons. It could be a lack of training. It could be injury. It could be lack of interest or motivation has decreased. It could be that the coach has hit a stumbling block or the relationship has hit a stumbling block, and trying to progress this performer further is more difficult than one would have thought. And they're the reasons behind a plateau. And there are learning curve examples.
5.3.4 wants us to discuss factors that contribute to the different rates of learning.
So that's learning curves that we've just looked at. And we discussed a few factors within that about rates of learning. However, there's many, many things that can contribute to different rates of learning. So what I want you to think about here is either a novice performer, it could be children's sport, it could be adult sport, it could be professional sport. Some of these things will be different for the scenario. We're going to start with learning environment. Now, if there's a safe teaching environment with limited distractions, this will lead to faster and more sustained progress, obviously. As long as the performer is focused on task and motivated. Small groups or individual sessions will accelerate the rate of learning further. Now, what I want you to think about here is things like when you're doing field events at school, athletics. It's a safe environment, therefore learning can take place. No learning would take place if there were shot puts flying everywhere. It wouldn't happen. But this can also be in any sporting example. If there's a safe, conducive learning environment, it's going to lead to better performance, it's going to lead to better learning. So that's learning environment. We've touched on this one already. We've got motivation. Can be related to two factors. One, intrinsic, so it comes from within you as the performer, or secondly, extrinsic, so it's external factors such as trophies or praise or money that motivates a performer. The strength of intrinsic motivation is a strong determining factor in the rate of learning. And this is at any level of sport. At the top level, where they're motivated with extrinsic trophies or prizes or even money for performing well and bonuses, it's still the intrinsic factors that are going to determine the better elite performers, the ones that get up before training starts and stay after training. They're the ones who are going to succeed the most. They're going to learn the most. But for amateur sport, intrinsic motivation is vital. I guess that's why there's the strong argument against the everyone gets a medal philosophy in school. As much as I understand that approach with regards to everyone's appreciated, does it lead to intrinsic motivation, or are people relying on external factors to turn up and participate in sport? There's an argument there, and there's an argument against the rate of learning. Yes, more people may come and get involved, but does it impact the rate of learning? And that's the discussion point that there is around that sort of philosophy. Next, we've got physical maturation. Now, young learners have difficulty in focusing. We know that. Anyone under the age of 10 is going to struggle to focus. So there's going to have to be important cues used to motivate them and to include them and to interest them into learning. There's also a difficulty in processing important information. They may not grasp the importance of a particular part of the skill. They might focus on another, or they might just pick and choose what they like to do and enjoy doing as opposed to what's important. So again, this can affect the rate of learning. Young learners may make a large number of mistakes, more so than older people. And when you mature, your motor plans begin to generate. You can start performing executive programs through the different phases of learning. Obviously start off in the cognitive, then we move into the associative, and then we end up in the autonomous stage through practice and practice and practice. And this all takes place over time, so therefore as we mature as well. On the topic of maturation, our next one is age. Now, let's not get these two mixed up. Maturation, we're talking about until we hit, adulthood. With age and emotional maturity, these things will affect the rate of progress. They'll hit a peak in the performer's 20s in most competitive sports. Some competitive sports allow performers to perform well into the 40s. Golf is an example, darts. Some Formula 1 drivers have been older. There are certain sports where age isn't as much a factor, but for most high-paced sports, in the 20s is their peak for their performance. Is it their peak for their learning? Who knows? But when we look at the learning and performance graph, it's obviously going to start deteriorating and become a negative accelerated curve over time through age. Next, we've got difficulty of task. An obvious one. It's obviously going to affect the rate of learning if it's a difficult skill to try and complete, to try and master, to try and learn. It brings obvious challenges. So with a more difficult task, there'll be slower progress made. Motivation will be challenged here. Now, if you are not motivated, you will not overcome an obstacle of difficulty. It's that open mindset, that willingness to continue to try. I can't do this yet, but if I keep trying, there's a chance I can do it. And this will make progress, and it's motivation that is the key here to ensuring that you can overcome this difficulty obstacle. So second to last, we've got physical fitness, and it's the quality of all the components of fitness, not just the stamina. Now with stamina, a learner is going to be able to make decisions more effectively if they're not fatigued. So that will affect the rate of learning, no matter what the skill is. Even if your level of cardiovascular fitness or stamina isn't being challenged, if that sport requires you to practice for a great length of time, then if you're fatigued, you're mentally fatigued, and that can still impact all the other components of fitness. So your stamina is going to be important. However, all the components of fitness are important here, and it could be a flexibility that's stopping you from making that progress. Flexibility is key in all sports, and one that's not necessarily focused on within amateur sport. Again, a golfer with a lack of flexibility in the shoulders, a swimmer with a lack of flexibility in the shoulders, a footballer with tight hamstrings might get injured a lot, therefore it affects the rate of learning because they'll be injured and not participating. Flexibility is important in every sport. You can do it for every sport. It's vital. A sprinter with the strides, a a long distance runner with the strides, etc, etc, etc. And you can do this for each of them. Strength, power, you could do it with them all. And if the physical fitness isn't of a quality that's required for that sport, it will impact the rate of learning, no questions asked. And lastly, we have the coach and the interaction of the coach or other individuals. It might be a teacher, it might even be a parent or a friend. Just outside input can be a huge contributing factor to the rate of learning. If the coaching and teaching style is not suitable for the performer, then it's going to impact the learning. And it might be that a coach and a performer really hit it off, and therefore the rate of learning goes through the roof and you start to have a linear curve or even an accelerated positive curve. You see many times professional athletes parting ways with their coach because they've just hit a stumbling block, whatever that may be. It's a really important relationship in order to make rapid progress within sport.
5.3.5 wants us to define the concept of transfer. Now, transfer is as it sounds, it moves from one thing to another. So if you learn a skill or a performance, transfer infers that you can transfer what you've learnt into another skill. So the learning of one skill or performance can influence the learning of another. 5.3.6 wants us to outline the types of transfer.
So the concept of transfer is a simple one, like we've just discussed. The learning of one skill can influence the learning of another. There's examples of transfer, and we're going to look at them now. Skill to skill means that if you can learn one skill, it would influence you learning another. So for example, a ground stroke in tennis might help a rounders player or a baseball player because it's that same waist, hand-eye coordination, skill taking place at the waist, and them two skills might be able to cross over. And what's taking place within your body can cross over in them two skills. And that's the obvious one, skill to skill. Learning one skill can influence the learning of another skill. Going into it in more detail, we've got other ones. Practice to performance. So you might practice jump shots in basketball, and you might try it from different scenarios. You're more likely to succeed doing this than just standing on the free throw line and practicing free throws. If you're practicing shooting from all over the key, behind the three-point line, with defenders, when it comes to a performance in a non-predictable environment, you're going to be in a better position to score the baskets. And it's practice to performance, and that's how that skill is transferred from practice into performance. You've got abilities to skills next. Now, abilities to skills can be talking about, to keep it simple, talk about your components of fitness and how that can be impacted into a skill. So if you've got fantastic balance, then that's going to help you as a gymnast or a dancer. If you've got fantastic power, you're going to be in a good position to the field events in athletics, and that might have been the case for you at school. If you've got fantastic height, you'll be a good centre in basketball. If you've got fantastic power and big physical presence, then your teacher might ask you to do the shot put or the discus at school. Them abilities can be transferred into skills quite quickly. Bilateral, learning a skill on one side of the body can influence the learning of the skill on the other side of the body. So using your right foot in football and understanding the teaching points, you can then try that with your left foot because you understand the teaching points on your right. You're not going to be able to do it as well unless you practice it because it's not your natural side, and it requires the same amount of hours of practice on that side as it does your strong side. But you can transfer the skill yourself with the teaching points in the cognitive stage of learning. Stage to stage. So like we've just said, you can be in the cognitive stage of learning. The more you practice, you're going to move into the autonomous stage with the associative stage in the middle, depending on how much you train, how much you practice, and how long you do it for. We've also got principles to skills. Now, principles to skills might be a tactic or an approach, and how you can put that to the skills in the match. So it might be a tactical approach of defending or attacking, and you then put that together with the skills that you've practiced in your performance. But what's important with these types of transfer, and we've spoke about them all in a positive manner, that you can also have a negative transfer, and it can negatively influence you learning a new skill. And some examples here, for skill to skill, a positive one might be a different racket sport. Table tennis, moving on to badminton, moving on to tennis with regards to your hand-eye coordination and certain strokes. However, it can be negatively influenced if you're trying to approach the shuttlecock at waist height because you're letting the shuttle come down like you would do a tennis ball instead of attacking it at its highest point. So the whole aspect of tennis can't be transferred into badminton, and the whole of badminton can't be transferred into tennis. Just like with squash, just like with table tennis, all these racket sports are different, and there's certain parts that can transfer for the positive, but there's certain aspects that would be classed by a coach as bad habits if you were to transfer them into other areas of the game. Practice to performance, well, we've discussed the positive. Practicing shooting in different scenarios, fantastic, and that can help. But if you don't practice in pressured situations, you might not be able to perform at a particular level. Now I'm thinking here slightly higher than the complete grassroots level. If you play in front of a crowd, it's good to practice in front of a crowd. That's why elite performers have open practice days. They don't just do it for the fans to come in. It's nice to feel a little bit of pressure of being watched while you're practicing. Puts a bit of reality to it. Also, practicing penalty shootouts in football is another great example. If you don't practice it in a pressurised situation, how can you then relate to it being in a pressurised situation? Same as a free throw in basketball. If it's the last couple of seconds and it's a clutch moment and you need to score, these high pressured situations, somehow you need to grasp that pressure in practice however you see fit, but it's vital for your progress. Otherwise it can be a negative influence on the skill being transferred. Abilities to skills, we spoke about the dancer or the gymnast having good balance, therefore it can transfer. What we haven't spoke about, how you can have too much of an ability, and this can impact your performance negatively. There's an example of a British sprinter from the early 2000s called Mark Lewis Francis. He got to the top level. He performed in the Olympics, he performed in the Commonwealth, performed in the European Championships, the World Championships. Didn't reach the heights that everybody expected him to. And a number of experts and coaches told Mark Lewis Francis that he was too muscular, he was too powerful, and it impacted his technique in a negative manner because he was too powerful and too strong and too bulky. So them abilities that you would usually relate to sprinting, such as power and strength and a big physical presence, you can actually have too much of it. And that impacted Mark Lewis Francis in his sprinting career and reaching his true potential. Bilateral, we've spoke about football, left foot and right foot. It's not going to help you in golf because one half of your body does something very different to the other. What my right arm does is very different to my left arm, and there's no point in me learning with my left arm what my right arm does. You know, if I keep my left arm as straight as my right arm during certain strokes, it's not going to impact me in any positive way. So it can negatively influence me in a bilateral way. And that's the same with many sports. Tennis, the same. Your forehand ground stroke is different to your backhand ground stroke. Your arms aren't going to move the same. Your skills isn't going to feel the same. It's a different skill. So therefore, the bilateral element can help in certain ways, but not in others. You're not going to hit a right-handed forehand instead of a backhand, for example, in tennis. Stage to stage, we've spoke about how you can jump between the stages, but the negative influence here could be it could be a step too far for you as a performer. So you could be fine at the cognitive level, but the minute you go to the associative level and you start thinking about the wider picture and not just thinking about that skill, your performance might dip, it might be a negative influence. And even further still, when you're going from the associative to the autonomous stage and your coach is firing 15,000 different tactical approaches at you, well, that can have a massive impact on your skill performance. And finally, principles to skills. We've spoke about how that can work with regards to tactics, but the negative principle to skills, similar here to the stage-to-stage jump from associative to autonomous. If your coach fires too many tactical approaches at you, you might not know what to do with your skill. You might be thinking about so many different things that you forget about the technique of the skill, and it can impact some people even at elite level here. Definitely lower down from elite level in the amateur game. And these are positive and negative ways that transfer can or cannot take place within the world of sport.
5.3.7 wants us to look at the different types of practice.
So here we've got 5 types of practice. Our first type of practice is called distributed. And this is as it sounds, it's distributed intervals. of training. So therefore, you get an opportunity to rest, an opportunity for mental rehearsal, and then you go again. And it's really good at beginner level, it's really good at youth level, and it's really good for demotivated athletes because it's in small doses. So therefore they can perform, reflect, perform, reflect, perform. And it's distributed. It's not just all in one hit. The opposite to this is massed and performance en masse, practice en masse. And continuous practice here takes place with no rest. And this is fantastic for experienced or elite or motivated performers. It's also great for fit performers because they can handle the pressure as opposed to needing a rest because the fitness levels aren't up to scratch. They're the people who are going to benefit the most from massed practice. Fixed practice, also known as drills. This is repeated practice, a particular skill, usually in a closed environment, to allow for skill development. And this is chasing that 10,000 hours philosophy. With good practice, if you get to your 10,000 hours mark, you should be classed as elite. Obviously, the big factor with that statement is that it's 10,000 high quality hours that will get you there, alongside ability. But fixed practicing in drills, that's one way you're going to get there. Now, these fixed drills, they can be within the massed and the distributed. You could do massed drills for hours on end. You could do distributed drills, but they're fixed. They're drills. They are good for discrete, closed skills within the sport. They help to develop subroutines. The opposite of this is variable. So the environment is variable. It's changing. That's what the word variable means. You should know that from your Unit 6 with your studies and your statistics studies. That variance, variable, it's changing. So practicing this has a variety of contexts. The skills are being performed in a variety of ways, practiced in a number of scenarios to replicate match play. And this is great for open, interactive skills. So for most open, interactive sports, fixed and variable drills and skills will be used at different times. And finally, we have mental practice. This is to prepare for the skill without actually carrying the skill out. So the cognitive phase, mental rehearsal, is used to assist a learner learning a skill. During the autonomous stage, mental preparation to ensure consistency and block out other distractions. There's a football goalkeeper or a soccer goalkeeper called David James. Elite, played for England a number of times, had a fantastic career in the Premier League, but was known as Calamity James, made a few mistakes. So what he did to try and combat the mistakes that he was quite prone to, in his latter years of his career, he'd warm up without a ball. And he'd look a bit crazy, if I'm honest. He'd be jumping around the grass on the pitch with all the other players on warming up and they're all using a ball. But he'd have no ball. He'd jump up and pretend to catch it. He'd pretend to take goal kicks. He'd pretend to throw the ball out. He'd be diving from one side of the goal to the other with no ball. And the reason he did this is he couldn't make a mistake in his warm-up. So he'd start the game with a high level of motivation, a high level of confidence, because he's not made a mistake in his warm-up. He would only introduce the ball in the last few minutes before the game started to do some basic movements. But all of the physical warm-up he would do without a ball. And this, for him and his psychologist, really helped him to try and limit the mistakes that he was prone to, even though he was a good goalkeeper.
Now we've looked at the different types of practice, we need to look at how this information can be presented. And 5.3.8 wants us to look at the different types of presentation.
So how practice is presented to a performer can vary as well. I'm going to start off with whole. Whole is as it sounds, it's the whole skill. So if it's a team game, you're playing a full team game. If it's a net game, you're playing the full net game. No matter what it is, you're doing the whole skill. And this is great for people in the autonomous stage because then they can practice the skill in match play, or even in the associative stage, they can practice in match play. But it's also good for autonomous because they can now include tactics and alternative scenarios in the real game. The opposite of this is part. And as this sounds, it's part of the skill. So the skill is broken down and it's learned in isolation. And this is where we'd use maybe fixed type of practice. in a drill, forming subroutines that can be later put back together in the full game. Any sport here can be broken down into a part or a drill, like I've said. Then we have combinations. So we have progressive part, and the idea with progressive part is to start with part of a skill. So let's say the ball is on the floor and you're passing over 5 yards in soccer, in football, between you and a teammate, inside of your foot. We can progress that. We can use the outside of our foot. We can progress it further distance between us passing. We can progress it even further. We can have a defender in there, maybe 2 or 3v1. We can progress it even further, have a short-sided match, 4v4, 5v5, and then finally we're ready to go back into the whole skill, 11v11, and passing is the focus of our 11v11. And that's how you can progressively work through part of a skill up to the whole skill again. And then lastly, we have whole, part, whole. Now, whole, part, whole is exactly as it sounds. We do the whole skill, we come into a part skill, we go back to a whole skill. Now, there's many examples here of how this can be used. This is fantastic for a new coach with a team. Right, we're going to play a full match. Let me see what I'm working with. Then we can break things down, work on a few things, go back to the whole game. And this whole, part, whole might be over a few sessions. But you can also do whole, part, whole in the one session. Shot put, this is one I use at school with shot put lessons. We all do the whole lesson, and I obviously stand with an authoritarian approach, dictating and leading for safety reasons. But then when certain things go wrong for performers, I send them off to a little station where they can work on part of their skill. And there's always the same things that happen with shot put. You're not getting enough height, you're not following through, you're throwing it instead of putting it, and therefore you're going to jerk your shoulder out. So I set up 3 practices with tennis balls where performers can work on these skills in isolation, and then when they've improved that, they can come back. So for example, if you're the type of person who chucks the shot put still and it's not on your neck, so it's a foul throw and you're going to dislocate your shoulder, I'll send you to that practice where you're against a wall and it's physically impossible to throw. Your hand has to come out straight against your neck. And when you practice that a number of times, you come back in and you're back in the whole skill practicing it. And this can be done in a number of ways. A nice fun example here as well, I like to talk about movies. Sister Act 2 from the early 90s. Halfway through the film, Whoopi Goldberg's the nun, she's got a choir. They sing in front of the whole school and they start singing and they're a bit shy and not very good. She takes over, goes back to the basics, doing singing practice, la la la, etc. Getting them back to the basics, and then they go back into singing the full song. So if you want to appreciate what a whole, part, whole looks like in real life, check out Sister Act 2 from the early 90s as well, that'll help you. But obviously I've given you many sporting examples here to help too.
So we have different types of practice, different types of presentation. Our last topic point wants us to look at the different types of teaching style that can be behind each of those practices and types of presentation.
So lastly, we've got the spectrum of teaching styles. Now, it isn't that one teaching style fits always, and that can be a major stumbling block for someone being a successful coach. You have to change your approach depending on the situation. We have 3 to talk about here. Command is our first one that we're going to speak about. Now, command approach means that you've got full control of the situation. It's an authoritarian approach, and the performer doesn't have a say, no input, they just do as they are told. Now, this is great, like I said earlier, in an athletics field event lesson at school where there's obvious dangers with the shot put, javelin and discus. So therefore, that approach is crucial, really, for safety. But when safety is set in stone, this approach really doesn't tend to have much impact if it's used over a prolonged time, because it can really deteriorate independent thinking skills, it can bring confidence down too. However, it can be useful with beginners to get up to a particular level. It can be useful with demotivated individuals to try and give them a kick up the backside to get to a required level. But you drop into this command style maybe for a few minutes and then come back out. You wouldn't maintain it if you're going to be a successful coach. Again, it's a spectrum. So moving into the middle of this spectrum, if you like, from command being on the one end, the middle of it would be reciprocal. Now, although the skill development is still determined by the teacher or coach, the objectives will be shared, so the overview is apparent. Therefore, there's an opportunity for collaboration. There's an opportunity for the performer to have their own advice and offer their own advice to either the coach or the other people in the team. about how the skill can be developed further. And this helps the performer's self-image, confidence, communication and leadership skills. However, it does take a little bit more time than the command style let's get this done approach. And time could also be an issue here with regards to how much time you have available. On the far end of the spectrum compared to command, we have problem solving, and time here is huge. You need time for this approach to work. It can be very effective if time is available, as the skills can be learned with complete motivation because the performer feels the ownership over the situation. They feel like they own it because they have come up with the ideas, they've developed the ideas with the coaches, with each other, and this method can really boost leadership skills, decision making, organisation skills, as well as prioritising skills about what to do next. And we can really think about what's important and the order of the importance of learning for each of us in the group, and that's problem solving as an approach to teaching.
Thanks for watching. If you're a teacher looking for teaching resources, don't forget to check out the Physical Educator TES channel, and you can pick up resources there for all units, including a detailed PowerPoint on skill in sport.